This is the Critical Therapy Antidote podcast with your hosts, Jaco van Sale and Christine Stephen. Welcome, everybody, to the Critical Therapy Antidote podcast. We're here today with Suzannah Alexander. Welcome, Suzannah.
Thank you.
Suzannah is a former student at the University of Tennessee, where she was studying in the counseling program. And you were trying to become a licensed professional counselor. Is that right?
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah, it was in there.
Okay, and now you've left and you've come and spoken out publicly about what you experienced there, and that's what we'd love to talk about with you today. And hear about what your journey was like up until this point. So tell us what happened. You were studying at the University of Tennessee, and when was the first moment that you noticed something didn't feel right about what you were learning or what was happening at the school?
Well, it's interesting that you asked that, because I just recently have gone back and written all of that up, but is putting together a Substack, but also to kind of get that straight in my head, how it all worked out. But the initial things that I noticed were little things, little political things. Like one of the professors made disparaging comments about J.K. Rowling, which at the time I was just kind of like, that seems a little odd to me, a little off. But other comments that some of the faculty made, which suggested a certain political worldview. And on my very first day, one of the interactions that I have, and this is the first day of class, we had a couple of days of orientation before that, but we were having a discussion, and I brought up, I had spoken earlier about my Buddhist background and a little bit about Shintoism as well, which I also have some interest in. And we were having a discussion, and just in more like mechanical terms, I talked about the central meditation of Buddhism, which is the doctrine of the non-self. And basically what it is it's a way of thinking where you try to diffuse your sense of self or your identity. You can think of it as an egolessness. At the time, the way that I described it is, I said, you can just reduce your sense of identity and you can focus on your values, just as a way. We were talking a lot about values because that program has a set of what they call chorus values that they very much adhere to, and we did a lot of work on. But we were talking about it, or I was talking about it as a way to align your behavior with what you want to represent in the world. And one of the other students fired back almost immediately, and I took it as kind of being called out, and they said that it was a privilege not to have to think about your identity, which it came across as antagonistic.
Mm-hmm.
That was the tone. Outside of that, it didn't make a whole lot of sense to me, because what I was talking about was a thought process, and there ended up being future friction with that particular student. But what was interesting is that none of the faculty really picked up on that, or said anything about that or clarified that. And there wasn't support for the idea that you want to find ways to reduce your fixation on yourself so that you can focus on actually performing these values, which they said were so important. And that I found, that was the first warning shot, I think. It came up again later, more specifically, like with not a whole lot later, like within the next 2 weeks, And we were talking about ways that you could control your reactions when you were in a situation maybe where a client was pushing your buttons. And I repeated that. And in that particular class, right after we were done, the professor approached me and said that that way of thinking, that process, may be invalidating to other identities, which I didn't really have a whole lot of experience with critical theories before then, or a lot of identity politics. And that just, it didn't make sense to me. I didn't understand what he was trying to say. Um, Later on that week, another professor approached me, and I hadn't even talked about it in her class, but basically said the same thing, that that was a problematic process and was invalidating to other identities. And I ultimately went and talked to my advisor about it. And I said, hey, don't you want us to, function through our values and, not think about ourselves so much? And he informed me that that would have been okay a few years ago, but not anymore.
Wow.
Did he
Yeah.
specifically say
Wow.
why it had changed from a few years ago, or what had changed from a few years ago?
He didn't elaborate on that. And I
Interesting.
was just, I was taken aback. I mean, I wasn't really even thinking about it in terms of, this is a pushback on Buddhism, because I don't typically think, I don't sit there and think, oh, I'm going to go be Buddhist right now. It's just a way that I think.
Mhm.
And I know that I got it from Buddhism, and I have to I had to backtrack to figure that out, because it's just a way of being for me.
Mhm.
And yeah, I was really taken aback, and it was like, that's really strange. And we were having all of these other things where we were encouraged to focus on their chorus values. We were told about them in class. They were included in the lectures. We had to write papers on each one. The first one, which, looking back on it, this was definitely a red flag, but the first one was on self-awareness. And when we had the lectures on self-awareness, the focus was on other people knowing us better than we know ourselves. And in a way to kind of break down our resistance to hearing criticism.
Mm.
And I don't know what other people's programs were like, but one of the things that we were told repeatedly at orientation and throughout the program is that as we moved down the trail, we would be getting more feedback about our performance and ourselves than we would ever want.
Yeah.
And that we should, be minding our mental health, and that sort of thing. And I hadn't really anticipated that that would be much of a problem. I mean, I've raised 4 teenagers. I've heard a lot about myself, and not not delivered in the best way possible.
Yeah.
Um, I just never expected that it would focus on things about myself that I can't change.
So let me ask you this, maybe just a bit of background. What was the major modalities, or what were the major modalities according to which you were trained in that course?
And by modalities, what are you
Was it
getting
was
at?
it was it like existential? Was it humanistic? Was it psychoanalytic? Was it
Mm.
systemic? What kind of modalities were predominant in that course?
Well, it's interesting that you bring that up, because I felt like that was the evidence-based part of psychology in this counseling program, in my opinion, was fairly weakly represented.
Mhm.
Our skills class was in person focused,
Okay.
and in there we were focusing on trying to interact with each other without ever asking questions.
Mhm.
We also had
Mm.
theories class, which was all about asking different kinds of questions. And that was a broad spectrum kind of thing. We went over uh, we went over a number of different therapies. We talked a little bit about reality therapy, solution-focused therapy. We did talk a little bit about dialectic behavioral therapy, which, you know, I was aware that that was had a lot of Buddhism in it. And you know, we also focused on acceptance and commitment therapy, which is also another majorly Buddhist influenced one. And so the contradiction between how I was being treated when I'm actually working through my emotions and my reactions based in a similar way to the way some of these therapies taught and Buddhism, and then we were being taught them, you know, and then being told, you know, that's not the right way to be, was very, it was very crazy making.
Yeah, so it was person-centered mainly by the sound of it, so very Rogerian, and those skills, you know, being present, unconditional positive regard, congruence, etc. Isn't it strange then that they would say something like, other people know you better than you do yourself? Because person-centered is precisely that, where you create this space where exploration takes place, where the person feels invited to share more of themselves, to put more of themselves out there, and you, almost as a type of container, a reflective container, facilitate this exploration and experimentation in a healing space. Why do you think were they so hung up on other people knowing you better than you do yourself?
In my opinion, I think that it was, I think maybe initially it was a way, maybe like years ago in the program, it was a way to prepare people to receive feedback about their performance as a therapist when they were learning, because you have to hear things that you don't really like to hear. I think what it became by the time I was there is a way to break you down and open people up to these ideas included in critical theories, because we did have an entire class where we were shown the big circle thing that
The wheel of
the ACE,
privilege or whatever it
yes,
is. Yes.
that the ACA has, and we were told, you know, you're either privileged or marginalized, and we talked about intersectionality. That was another class where I ran into some trouble, because afterwards I told the professor, you know, I asked what the value of this material was, and I said that I felt like it encouraged tribalism and hostility. And they didn't, the professor didn't immediately say, you know, oh, you better not say that. But the tenor of things changed after that.
It's really interesting because as a professor myself, one of the things that we encourage, or that the point we like to drive home, is that we don't know more about the client than the client knows about themselves. That's one of the big components. You're being kind of stripped of that, the complete opposite. But in reality, we don't serve as the expert on the client's life or serve as the expert on the client themselves. The client is the expert in their own lives. We're merely a guide, a pathway. We're there to, you know, kind of help maneuver through all of that. So it's interesting that that's one of the basic tenets, I think, and Yako, correct me if I'm wrong, of traditional therapy, is that we're not the expert, the client is the expert, and our job isn't to be the expert in the room. So the whole basis there is just really upside down, backwards.
The attitude seemed to be that as therapists, we were not allowed to have those same boundaries as a client would have. And, you know, we were expected to move to a higher standard. And there were even a number of times in the lectures, particularly when they were talking about their chorus values, where things were framed in a way that this is something that you always have to strive for. You're never going to make it. You're never, very much with an idea or, a thinking behind it that you're never going to be good enough. And you're always going to have to push and push and push to get to this ephemeral idea of, whether it was self-awareness or commitment was another one of those values. There was.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt you. I think as a principle, I think it is good to tell people that there is always room for improvement. But we know that there is a difference here, and this is the pivoting that takes place, where a person is being told that there is always room for improvement. You'll always improve, however slightly. It's like the principle of the mandala. You only approximate the divine, or you only approximate perfection. You never reach perfection by all means. But we know that there is a distorted, a perverse distortion of this principle in terms of social identity and critical theory, where you as a white person can never be non-racist. You can only approach anti-racism. You can only approach non-racism. And this is the distortion that they smuggle in where it comes to this new woke, acceptable doctrine of stereotypes that suddenly became acceptable. In the past, you never worked according to stereotypes because every individual was unique. And to some extent, there may be similarities between the individual and broad stereotypes, but in many, I would go as far as saying, in most cases, individuals differ significantly from stereotyps.
Well, it ignores the nuance of life, the nuances.
It ignores the nuance of life. And in addition to that, the basis of psychotherapy is the process of recognition, and to be present, to reflect, to be attuned, and to anticipate response from the other. You do it with your client, your client does it with you. And that is the healing space that takes place. And you establish a space of trust, and attuned recognition is healing, because when you need to share something with a client that the client might be resistant to incorporating, because there is trust and because there's a history of attunement, incorporation takes place. And then there would be psychological growth. And again, they use that space of trust, that sacred healing space, and they distort it into this critical therapy woke space where they feed you stereotypes, and you almost need to imbibe the stereotypes whether they apply to you or not. Needless to say, that's not healing.
Yeah, that what you described is what I thought that we were going to be learning, and what the experience was going to be like and about. And that's not what I experienced at all. And as it got toward the end of the semester, and I did get to know some of the other members of my cohort a little bit, the age difference was definitely a real barrier there. But I heard more from some of my classmates, different aspects of the same problem that I was having. And, there was a lot of anxiety throughout the whole cohort. Whenever we did a role play sort of thing, anxiety was something that came up over and over and over. And a number of my classmates were very reluctant to speak in class and in other areas. And looking back on it, I have to wonder how much of it was they just didn't feel like they could say the right thing. And I heard after I left that a number of my former classmates were afraid to speak at all, because there had been no explanation from the faculty as to why I wasn't there anymore. I just wasn't there. And I
Did you
think that
leave, did you leave out of your own choice, or was it the school and you had come up with an agreement that you should leave? How did that go?
well, the way that it played out, by the end of the semester, I had been, in support sessions. I had reached out and asked for those after I had some significant problems in the small group. And I was threatened that I was going to get a support plan. If I did not, I was labeled as transphobic. I don't know why, from one of my professors, and I don't know which professor. And I was also told that my thinking was too concrete and I needed to fix those things, or I was in danger of getting a support plan. And, shortly thereafter, I had my small group that included the person that had called me out as, privileged for thinking the way that I think. And they were in the small group, and it blew up. I'm not going to talk about the details because that was supposed to be a confidential sort of thing. But I will say that when you teach people that certain groups are responsible for the problems and feelings of other groups, that does not lead to good results. That's
No,
combustible.
it is combustible. It creates dependency, resentment, and entitlement. The victimized group think that they can resort to destructive behavior to their heart's delight, and it's always the other person who's to blame for it. We see it not only in some of these radical groups of so-called minorities, we also see it in addiction. When you work with severe personality pathology, especially the cluster B pathologies, narcissism, the borderline, antisocial personalities, hysterical personalities, etc. But toward the more severe end, you always have this external locus of control, the inability to carry their own agency or contribution to a destructive dynamic. It's always the other person's fault. And what it sounds to me like, it was such a condemning space. I can't imagine that education can take place in such a space. Because with education, even with harsh feedback, you need to believe in what you practice. And if what they require of you is to adopt doctrine that is diametrically opposed to your value, you will not incorporate that doctrine into your set of values.
Yeah. And
yeah, keep going.
well, I was going to say that is where I ended up. And at the end of the semester, I was told that, I had gotten 3 A's and a B plus, but I wasn't allowed to move on into my practicum. I was told that I needed to have at least another year, and that's when I walked away.
Did they tell you why you weren't ready? I mean, with the grades that you had, what was the rationale, the thinking behind you not being ready to start seeing clients? That's, in practicum, that's when we start seeing clients. How did they come to that conclusion if you had received such high marks?
Well, what they cited was the problems that I had with some of the students. And they also said my advisor described my Buddhist practice as a schema that I needed to correct. He said it's that thing you do where you reduce your sense of identity and elevate your values. He called it a schema, and I needed to correct that. And it was absolutely abusive what happened in that room. But the other professor who was there, she went on and said that I was terrible at skills class. I got an A in skills, but she said that I was terrible. She said that the other students were just being nice to me, that I was so bad. They just wouldn't tell me how terrible I really was. She went on and
so
on.
Abusive. This sounds incredibly emotionally abusive.
Yeah, it absolutely was. It was terrible.
It is so interesting to hear you speak. It is so easy, especially with something like Rogerian or person-centered therapy, where there are abstract concepts that need to be operationalized. In other words, when we say you need to be congruent, what does it mean to be congruent? You need to be present. What does it mean to be present? Those are sufficiently abstract concepts such that someone who wants to abuse their authority could use those concepts as justification, and your failure to living up to those abstract concepts as justification for their abusing you. Because that sounds to me like that was what they did. When they say that you took concrete, what does that even mean? Because if someone is too concrete, it means that they have a difficulty conceptualizing and working with abstract ideas, metaphor, nuance, social cues, etc. And we see this in severe disorders, acute disorders like depressive disorders, neurodevelopmental disorders like autism, also in schizophrenia, where a person might be very, very concrete.
Rigid.
How does it, very rigid, right? How did it apply to you, especially if you're a Buddhist? I mean, working with these abstract concepts is like, that's your vocabulary, that's your way of thinking. It is the strangest thing.
Yeah, I can't even imagine what was going on in her thinking. But yeah, in addition to saying those things, she also said that my thinking was legalistic. She said that my thinking was black and white. I think, looking back on it, I think that for the most part, what she wanted to do was, I think she wanted to shut me down. But I feel like, I mean, I can't know what's inside her head, but I think on some level she wanted to maybe take her frustrations out on me. Because there was at one point in one of these meetings where I was trying to communicate that I understand nuance and can see things from different sides, and that I'm aware that I wasn't perfect. And I said that I was aware that I had a dark side. And she went so far as to say that my using the word dark shows that I have black and white thinking. And, I, at that point I said, well, it could have been charcoal or, light gray. And, there was no way for me to be good. And I think there was some black and white thinking going on there, but I don't think it was mine.
Yeah, you see, at some point, the commitment to gaslighting becomes clear, and gaslighting is just deliberate misunderstanding. When they're so biased, when you've been marked, when you don't go along with their idea, especially their doctrine of critical social justice, when you don't go along with it, it is just understandable that such fanatical, radical, almost cultists would want to target you and make an example, scapegoat you, as it were. Maybe I can just ask you this. What was your wider situation, your family situation? How did you cope in these circumstances?
It was pretty difficult. I had gone back because I had just gotten divorced, and my divorce situation was pretty contentious. It was a situation where there was a lot of black and white thinking in my partner, and that had pushed me to go to my own therapy and work through that. And I was, to some degree, familiar with that personality type, that kind of rigid thinking. And, I was away from that in my personal life because I was post-divorce, but I was still putting together the pieces with my kids, living on my own. I felt fairly insecure at the start, just in going back to the workforce, going back to school. It was a pretty big leap to do that at my age,
Mhm.
and to try and move into a field that I really love, psychology. I've
Mm.
done so much reading. I just love it and enjoy it. And figuring out how to move on from my divorce was a big motivator for that interest. And I wanted to learn more. I mean, I definitely went into the program just thirsty for more knowledge in that regard. Um, but yeah, outside my family situation, I have some friends, but I'm still building up my support in this area because I had only moved to Tennessee in 2018,
Mm.
and then the pandemic started at 2020. So I knew some people, but I didn't have like a really big, robust support network. So that made it a bit harder.
Mm.
I at least had the experience of having been through dealing with emotional abuse, that I was aware of my own feelings, and at different portions, while I couldn't get away enough to really thoroughly think through some of the things that were going on. I mean, I had to make choices about whether or not I was going to actually do my assignments and fulfill those obligations in order to do the work. And there was so much schoolwork that I didn't have the luxury of a lot of time to, step away and say, hey, this seems a little crazy. Can you walk me through that? But I did enough of it that I was able to make it to the end of the semester.
Mm.
Mm.
Um,
Mm. So what was it like for you to leave? I mean, and maybe this is for me, when I had to make that decision and I actually did leave, it was actually quite painful. It was something that I had to let go of, and I felt as though I went through a grieving process. And I'm wondering for you, was that similar, having to leave what you came in with so many hopes, and it sounds like something that was going to be very stabilizing for you during a very unstable time in your life, and to have to kind of give that up, what was that like to do that?
it was really awful. It was, I'm not sure if I would actually say it was a hard decision,
Mm.
because I had decided before I walked into that last meeting that I wasn't gonna, I had already decided that I was not going to move forward in any sort of circumstance where I had to apologize for being white or
Mm-hmm.
Buddhist or any of the other things. Um, but it was very painful because I
I
had
can imagine.
I had no idea what I was going to do.
Mm-hmm.
Um, to some degree, I had internalized some of the shame that they were pushing out. Um, and it took quite a few months afterward before I was able to do things in a functional kind of way. I mean, there were several weeks afterwards, I just sat in my living room and I had one of those little liquid sand things, and just flipped it back and forth and just watched the sand go up and down.
Mm-hmm.
And I wasn't functional at all. I cried all the time. I would experience these waves of shame where I was just afraid to, am I a horrible person? I know, and I'm sure that I annoyed my kids a little bit, saying, am I really a horrible person?
Mm.
Um, and at the same time, because I had been through something similar before, I was able to recognize that those didn't make sense. I mean, I would have to go through it, though. I'd have to talk myself through it and say, well, no, you're not transphobic. You actually have pictures of where you marched in the Knoxville Pride Parade, probably not transphobic to do that,
Mhm.
you know, and I would have to go through all of these things that I had done in the past and remind myself, you know, that I was not what they were saying that I was. And even though intellectually I was ahead of myself in that, you know, like I could talk it through and remember it, emotionally, it just took a while
Yeah.
before I felt that way. And I stopped beating myself up and experiencing that as like an emotional, overwhelming thing where I just, you know, wasn't even sure what to do with myself.
Mm.
And it continues to be something that occasionally I'll struggle with little bits of it, you know, here and
Mhm.
there.
Mhm.
Um, and I was pretty fearful of people when I first came out as well. I just, you know, I didn't like to be around people that I didn't know.
Mhm.
Um,
It is
and
threatening.
yeah, and I experienced fear in terms particularly of meeting people that looked physically different from me.
Mhm.
And that was a real hard one because I knew that that is not who I wanted to be. I mean, I didn't want to be fearful and I didn't want to presuppose things about people just based on their outside characteristics. And I would argue with myself and say, you know, you're okay. You know, you have to move forward and not function from a place from fear, but you also can't presuppose what other people are thinking,
Mhm.
even though I had such clear evidence that there was, you know, not only were people thinking that way, there was this whole group of people that were teaching other people to think in this very racist way,
Yeah.
which has been very, very horrifying for me.
Yeah.
And that has, it's really galvanized me to fight against it. That's why I have been speaking out and why I've dug into the history of counseling and why I'm here right now. Because I think that what this is, I mean, not only is it educational malpractice for me personally,
Mm.
but for all of the counselors that they're putting out, you know, how are they supposed to make the world better and help people with their problems if it's coming from the standpoint that we have these original sins if
Mhm.
you're white, or conversely, if you're not, you're just never going to be good enough.
Mhm.
You know, it's just mind-boggling to me.
I think that's what was the most painful for me as an educator because, my story is that I was a professor in one of these programs and I left because of what we were required to teach. But I think that's what's the most painful part is that the amount of students that I had that came to me that told me how traumatized they were just being in the program and being in classes and not being able to speak up and not being able to say what they really thought. People that told me the most traumatic time in their entire adult life had been the 2 or 3 years that they were in the program. That was heartbreaking to hear because not only were we not providing quality education or the education that we need to equip our students with to go out there and be good, strong clinicians, we were actually damaging them in the process. And that was absolutely horrifying. That is what broke my heart the most about it. So just hearing you, it's almost like being right there again with one of my own students or one of my own advisees telling me, the amount of sorrow that was that had overcome them when they were really so hopeful to start, such an exciting chapter in their lives. It's very
I want to pick
distressing.
up. No, I wanna pick up on what you said. You said you were so sick of all the shame that they were pushing out. It's an interesting expression, pushing out. What do you mean
Hmm.
by that?
That's how it felt. Um, I I don't typically, I mean, I'll catch myself occasionally being a little hard on myself. Um, Generally speaking, though, I don't think in ways where I characterize myself as inherently bad. That is the kind of thought that just doesn't make sense. Things are not totally black and white. And when I was going through those feelings and feeling that way, I had a sense in myself that this is not like me. It didn't feel like it was quite my feeling. And, I had read enough in other areas of psychology. I was familiar. I know what projective identification is. And it just felt like that. It didn't feel like my feeling, but it was definitely inside me. And it was awful. And in some ways, I feel like what I was going through was purging that out. But it wasn't my shame. It was someone else's. And I don't know which part of the program exactly it was coming from. Definitely those support meetings where it was so abusive added to it for sure. But even before those, I felt some of that. I felt at times very flattened out. And I was I like to write stories, and outside of this work, I'm also an artist, and I would notice it coming through in the things that I wanted to create or the ideas that I had. And one of them was I had this idea for a story where I walked into the educational building and was just kind of met by something that smashed me into like a flat Stanley, that little kid's character where it's made out of paper and is totally flat. um and afterwards I went through a similar sort of creative cycle, just playing around with ChatGPT, and I kept asking it over and over again to write fairy tales. And eventually I realized that what I was trying to do was rewrite Animal Farm. And then I'm like, okay, all righty, I have figured that out now.
I think you picked up on what I may have wanted to also drive towards, and that was this concept of projective identification and the shame that they were pushing out. And this pushing out is a concept that was formulated by a post-Freudian called Melanie Klein. And she conceptualized some of the anguish that the infant felt, like anguish that they defecated. But it wasn't just defecating, it wasn't just getting rid of the anguish. It was also inserting that anguish into the other. And that happens in a very old, primitive schema, talking about schemas, where the infant still resorts to paranoid splits, all good and all bad splits, where everything is either all good, all bad, including themselves. And when they're in anguish, they want to get rid of the bad aspects of themselves because they've experienced it as life-threatening. And then the bodily expression is like screaming, but specifically defecating it out. And those, like I said, those are primitive defenses, and we all have elements of that depending on our personality structure. But one, again, in severe pathology, and secondly, in masses, in groups, in packs, in tribes, we tend to resort to those primitive defenses. And that process of projecting what is bad within us into the other person, that is projection. But projective identification is when that keeps happening and the other person doesn't catch that projection, they amplify the projection and they become more abusive and more violent and more threatening until the other person catches that projection and identifies with it. That is projective identification. And I can see that they were able to do that with you, and that they're able to do that with any one of us. And you would, if you have mirroring neurons, and if you are attuned to the other person and you're empathic, you'd be particularly vulnerable to projective identification. because you would reflect, you would think, is this person right? Remember, what they're projecting into you feels utterly real. When I do supervision with some of the psychologists that link with me, and I explain to them projective identification, I usually use this metaphor of the matrix, where you find yourself in a space and then suddenly it's almost these pixels, and you're in a different world. And that is how projective identification works. The person with whom you are in relation there experience it as such real truth that you almost can't else but live with it, live with that enactment. You engage with that, you're engaged with that enactment. The trick is then to catch yourself and to start thinking, as opposed to just blindly participate in that projective identification. And that is what the critical social justice radicals do. And that's what they're great at doing.
Mm-hmm.
They don't want the shame. They don't want the guilt. They want to rid themselves of the guilt because they're as much subject to their destructive and cannibalistic doctrine of critical social justice. I mean, who wants to fall under the condemnation of critical social justice? There's no redemption under that way of thinking. So they don't want the guilt and the shame, but man, do they know who to project that into. Those who tend to feel guilty, who tend to feel responsible, who really want to make this world a better place. And that seems to be, you know, some of us.
Mm-hmm.
What do you make of that?
Well, that seems to be pretty on target, I think.
Mm-hmm.
I think that that's how this is functioning, in particular on a societal level. You know, I'm an individual and I experienced it in that context, but I think that on a broader scheme, I think that that is what's happening. I think that those of us who have experienced it individually are places where we have become particular targets for it. But I think that the whole mindset is just, it's wandering around looking for targets, you know, and it's going to find them. You know, nobody's perfect. And if you're moving through the world looking for the person who's done the wrong thing for, you know, to you, you're going to find them, I mean, sooner or later.
And that plays out in envy too. Envy is the instinct to level out. If you encounter the other person and they possess something that you wish you had, you either incorporate that and try to improve yourself so that you can also be as good and even better than the other person. But the envious impulse then wants to destroy what the other person has, to trash it, to spoil it. And isn't it interesting when you spoke about this Buddhist practice of ego emptying, of self-emptying? The response was, oh, you've got to be so privileged to be able to do that. You see that envious impulse, immediately dismissing, not recognizing the value of it, not reflecting on it, that maybe I could benefit from improving my practice, improving myself as a person by thinking about that, by engaging and studying that practice. Not that. No. Instead, we engage in that destructive, envious process of trashing, spoiling with nothing else than critical social justice. Sorry, Christine.
I was just, go ahead, continue.
I was just going to say, it's interesting that you brought up the envy, because at various points I did wonder if that wasn't an underlying factor, and not just for that particular student that called me out as privileged, but from the faculty as well. And I don't know why they would have envy for me, but there were definitely times where I had an intuition that that might be underlying some of the, particularly the more egregious attacks on me.
So where do you find yourself today in your work and in what you want to be doing next? It's unfortunate you had to give up career that you were just on the brink of starting, but how have you kind of taken that and pushed yourself forward in a different direction?
Well, one of the things that I've done is it initially started is just needing to understand how the field had come to a place that this is how their training programs were working. I had no expectation that I would be walking into something like this at all. And I needed to understand how that happened. So I did some research into the field, into the history, and I found some things that really just absolutely blew me away, horrified me. Starting in 1988, Counselling had a big gathering where they had people from the ACA and the licensing boards, and they all got together and they put together what they thought was going to be a pathway to the future. And a couple of things that they included in that was this group decided that counselors needed to accept multiculturalism as a value. And they said that they needed to encourage clients to accept multiculturalism as a value in their written documents. I mean, I can hardly wrap my head around that. They went through this process. They had another large meeting in 1998, two of them, and they excluded people who didn't agree with what they were starting to do. That's when they added advocacy as what was to be the hallmark of counseling, which I think was at best a questionable idea. And, at worst, I think it really was the deciding factor that turned the profession away from mental health and toward this goal of being moralistic. But I ended up writing an article pulling all of that together, and saw it published at Minding the Campus.
Wonderful.
And I've been trying to get that word out there so that other students don't walk into that not knowing what they're getting. Because it never occurred to me that I was basically going into a boot camp to be an advocate, because I wouldn't describe what they were teaching as counseling that's focused on creating that space that you were talking about, where you're actually working toward exposing yourself to the truth and then deciding how you're going to cope with it. It wasn't about the truth. It was about a moralistic vision of how the world is supposed to be and how are we going to force people to do whatever it is that the ideology says we need them to do right now. And
it was training activists, essentially.
Yeah.
And you were unfortunately one of the victims of that.
Yeah.
And what kind of work are you doing now? I know that you're working, is it okay to mention you're working with FAIR? I worked for FAIR for a bit myself, and they seem to be the kind of catch-all that people fall into once they end up speaking out. I'm not working for them anymore, but through this work, I've met a lot of people involved with FAIR. So would you be interested in sharing just a bit about that work on the episode?
Yeah, I am the Tennessee coordinator. So there had not been one before I started. So I'm basically starting from a flat playing field here. And I've mostly been there in Tennessee. I think for the most part, there's not the sense of the pressure of what's happening that maybe there is in the Northeast, because I've had some people from the organization, the people who have contacted FAIR here in Tennessee reach out to me, but for the most part, I think because it's such a strongly Republican state, there's not the immediacy
Yes,
that something
yes,
needs to be done.
yes.
So I've been working to let people know, hey, it's here too,
Mhm.
Yeah.
and it's not good. This is a real problem. I reached out to some of my lawmakers and some other groups in the area. I'm still pretty early on in that
Mhm.
right now.
Okay.
Mm. Yeah, false sense of security. It's just a
Right.
wooden
Everywhere.
horse. It's everything but just a wooden horse. It's a Trojan horse.
Yes.
It is so yes, false sense of security. I don't think one should underestimate the invasiveness and the destructiveness of critical social justice.
I think in the US, we tend to frame it as though this is a blue state issue or it's a blue city issue, that the red states or the red cities are free from that. But that's really, I mean, and I'm glad you mentioned that it's still here too, even though you're in a highly Republican area, because in these programs that are across the country, they are in highly Republican states as well as they are in blue states. And the well is being poisoned just as bad as it is in those areas, as it is in other parts where we tend to think people are going to be a little more liberal minded, and these tend to be kind of values that end up, surfacing in more liberal cities. But that's not really the case. It's actually embedded everywhere. I have a really good friend in Utah who's struggling to, get some kind of change made and some kind of law changes on the high school and elementary school levels, not quite the university levels that we're talking about. So it's a false sense of security to think that if I'm in a red area, I'm going to be protected from this. It's really not true anymore.
Well, I think that one of the things that people don't realize is that the way that the field has put itself together is the accreditation body for
Yes.
these university programs,
Yes.
CACREP. They require the kind of
Yes.
DEI infused or embedded program,
Yes.
because that was one of the things I came up in my research, and they've recently redone their standards for 2024, and they straight out say that DEI needs to be infused through the entire programs. And what you have on the other side of that is you have the ACA pushing CACREP accreditation as a requirement for licensure all over. And here in Tennessee, it is one of the conditional requirements. It's not the only one. So there are other pathways to licensure, even if you don't come from a CACREP accredited program. But over half of the states have some level of requirement for that. And I don't think people realize that that's affecting all of the counselors, including the K through 12 school counselors.
Yes.
So what you're doing is you're creating this group of activists, and you're using the licensure to say that anyone doing this profession has to be this kind of activist, and then you're installing them into the schools.
Yes.
So
that is 100% right on.
Yeah.
I'm
That's
really
where we're struggling
concerned.
with our boards. It's a huge concern. It's a huge, and that's Yaku, where the APA concerns become so problematic, because
Absolutely.
this is exactly what you're describing, Suzanne, is the exact reason why we can't seem to get this stuff out of the programs. It's because it's tied into the accreditation, it's tied into licensing, it's tied into these bigger monsters that we're dealing with. And this is why it becomes extremely difficult, no matter where you go to school now, no matter what state you live in. It's a huge problem. That's where it feels insurmountable at times, I have to say.
One of the things that I would like to see, and if there is anybody in the law field out there, I think that the issue is with the accreditation bodies.
Yes.
One of the things that they promise in their accreditation is that schools will make an effort to retain students, which is absolutely not what happened in my case. And I complained to the ACA. They dismissed my case.
Well, I'll
But they're
tell you
getting,
just a little bit of, insider baseball here, because I left as a professor and I was very honest about why I was leaving. And the answer back to me was, well, we've got to do something. We have to include something about DE&I. So this is what we're going to choose to include, which means that they were operating from a much bigger, a group of conglomerates, really, that had more say and more control, that they had to do something. So this is what we're going to do. It was what was recommended to us. So it wasn't even so much that the school bought into it as a whole, as it was that there needed to be something because they needed to maintain their accreditation. So
They were
that's
just
right there.
following marching orders.
They're following
from
marching
elsewhere.
orders from elsewhere, correct. And that actually was more I was more incensed by that, because I felt like at least you should be believing in what you're saying then. But if you don't, this is even worse. So yeah, so that's what we're operating with.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to say that there's no down regulation here. And that is part of the extremist nature of critical social justice. You can only be a better, more radical critical social justice warrior. There's no down regulator. So should they implement these measures and organizations fall apart because they're fuming, they're inciting tribalism, stereotypical relating to one another, inducing large group narcissistic large group regression, and organizations fall apart, they will not halt and think, what was our contribution to this destruction? Because there's no facility. They do not tolerate this reflection. They can only be more radical in their application. It's like riding a bike, putting a stick in the spokes, falling over, and looking for someone to blame, but never themselves. And I mean, in nature, we find this too. In certain viral infections, cancer is a classical example where there's no down regulation, and we know what cancer does to a system. And this is, so that is just a metaphor, but I think this is the destructive potential of critical social justice, because of just, if we only have to focus on that aspect of it to establish it. So, and I think it is just valuable to say that we at Critical Therapy Antidote, we are committed to providing an alternative. And we have a schedule of regular meetups where we provide supervision and a space to think about these things and to address these issues in ways that are still healing, without resorting to the tribalism, to reintroduce and to maintain a space of healing in our practices.
Yes.
And that is our commitment. And even thinking about the articles that we write, we formulate what is going on, but we also offer a picture of what a better future and what a better structure of training should look like. Would you say that there is a great need for these kinds of organizations, these parallel organizations, to establish a culture and to reestablish a healing ethos in psychotherapy?
Oh, I absolutely do. Absolutely. Because I think that therapy, from the standpoint of critical social justice, is going to lead to malpractice. I don't think that it is healing. I think it's hurting people. And I think that there will be a continuing need, maybe an escalating need, as people go through that. They're damaged, they're hurt, they need to be recovered on the other side. I absolutely do think that. And I also think that there needs to be an alternate form of training people who are coming into the profession. If we have a system right now that is almost completely captured by this ideology, none of the people coming through that are going to really be qualified to
Right.
practice appropriately. And, you know, I'm trying to draw attention to some of these structures so that they can either be dismantled or changed or eliminated, whatever is required. But that is going to be a big job, and it's going to take a long time. And in the interim, you know, what we have is hurting people.
I don't think we have time to wait.
Mhm.
I don't think we have time to wait for these organizations to finally realize that what they're doing is destructive. I think that time is ripe, and like I said, that we at CTA are grabbing hold of the opportunity to provide an alternative. And I mean, if there are trainee counselors, if there are counselors, even lecturers listening to our podcast, we want to invite you to join us.
Yes.
We have regular meetups where we discuss these things. And I mean, the response that we've received from the trainees and from other practicing professionals, the response has been very, very positive, because people are hungry and thirsty to return to proper psychotherapy again.
Mhm. Yeah, I definitely think that that is the way to go. I mean, if there was a way that I could practice, that's what I would do.
Mhm.
But that's where the licensure problem,
Yes.
you know, hits you.
Yeah. Well, we've come to the end of our time together, but Suzannah, we want to thank you so much for coming on and being so open and raw and just extremely transparent about what you went through and what is actually happening, even in schools or places in the country here in the US that we think are sheltered from this or not affected or impacted. I think it's so important that that they have a voice as well. And so it's been such a pleasure to hear your voice and have you
Thank
share
you.
what you experienced.